So I got my PhD in physics from the University of California, Irvine, where I studied something called the radical pair mechanism. And it's a mechanism that's believed to allow birds the ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field in order to navigate.
In today's episode, I am speaking with Dr. Tiffeny Todd. She earned her PhD in physics from the University of California, Irvine, where she researched a mechanism believed to give birds their ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field to navigate, which explains a lot about signs when people will say a bird came to them after the passing of a loved one. And there can be some.
So my documentary is called Playing My Mind's Symphony. It's an hour-long documentary where I have conversations with four amazing women who are experts in different areas of mind and consciousness and the science of spirituality.
And today she is a department chair and associate professor of physics at Pierce College in Washington State. Hi, today I am speaking with Dr. Tiffeny Todd, and she reached out to me. She's working on a documentary and seems to be questioning and researching with a logical approach, just the way I am and a lot of, I think, all of you are who are listening. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So, would you mind just telling us all a little first about, I guess, your credentials and then the documentary you're working on?
Yeah. So I got my PhD in physics from the University of California, Irvine, where I studied something called the radical pair mechanism. And it's a mechanism that's believed to allow birds the ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field in order to navigate. And that research actually is central to the theory of consciousness that I'm now developing and proposing. I'm currently a professor of physics at Pierce College in Washington. And in addition to teaching, I do theoretical research in the science of how mind could exist beyond brain, or as I like to say, non-local consciousness, meaning consciousness that's not localized in a brain, but could potentially effectuate phenomenon beyond the physical body and even exist beyond the physical body.
My God, you're like my dream person to have on. I'm so excited. And we need so many more people in your kind of roles studying this in a serious way. I think excuse me, I think as we get more people, this probably not in our lifetime, but this will crack the answer to survival of consciousness.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think at this stage, a lot of the work that's been done in parapsychology or even mediumship is what are called behavioral experiments. So, really just attempting to establish that the phenomena of non local consciousness is real, establishing that mediumship is real or psychic phenomenon is real. And that research has been going on for many, many decades. And the next sort of step, I think, for that research to be more broadly discussed in the scientific community is really to have an explanation for how such a thing could be possible. I think a lot of the scientific establishment sort of ignores the research, the behavioral experiments in parapsychology, because it just really seems counterintuitive to, I guess, the physics and the science that they know. So, most of the studies that are being done in parapsychology are being done by medical doctors or psychologists. And that's been great work. But just as you said, we really need more physical scientists to get involved in this research in order to make progress on the theoretical scientific basis for how mind could exist beyond the brain.
And before I get into asking you some about your documentary, I just want to ask you a little about the birds and touch on one thing. I know I touch upon this in my book, but there's a medium, Laura Lynn Jackson. I guess a lot of people know her. She's really blown up, which she really deserves. And she's worked with so many scientists, and I went to one of her early workshops, and I'd heard about signs and, this bird came to my house after my grandma died. And I was like, oh my God, that's such bullshit. So you're telling me they're like, your grandma's a fucking bird now? Come on. So Laura mentions birds, and I asked her, I was like, that doesn't make sense. So they're a bird? And she's like, no, they follow, their navigational system follows the magnetic fields. And so that's how, so essentially a form of non-local consciousness can use those fields, interdimensionally. We don't really have the proper definition yet because we don't really understand it, but somehow we'll use those fields to direct the birds using their navigational system. So when you just said that about birds, I'm like, whoa, so physicists are saying this too now. That's so encouraging.
Yeah, and I can take that one step further. I know Laura Lynn Jackson. I actually just attended one of her workshops in January, and it was wonderful. I've gone to a lot of workshops with mediums and psychics, and I have to say, this is probably one of the best.
Wait, the one in January in LA?
Yes.
I was there. I'm so sad I didn't get to say hi to you. No way.
Oh, wow. That is such a synchronicity. We
Mhm.
were in the same space and didn't even have the opportunity to connect. I don't know what you thought. I thought it was one of the best workshops I'd been to. I really loved the combination of the science as well as, Laura Lynn Jackson talking about her own experience as a medium, and then making it very practical where we were able to engage in that. I cannot.
Unfortunately, I actually didn't make it to the workshop. I realized that time I went to her readings the night before and, got to chat, like say hi and, so I didn't, I missed that workshop, but I've gone to plenty of her other workshops.
Oh, so we just missed each other.
You weren't at the reading. Okay. So we weren't in the same room together. Okay.
But that's incredible. Yeah, I love that she gives the audience various exercises so that they can have experience, that they can have these psychic experiences. And I talk about this in my documentary, some of the psychic experiences that I've had. And I think that's really key as well. Scientists who've actually experienced non-local consciousness are, I think, the best to propel the science forward in collaboration with intuitives who are really experts in that. So that was,
Mhm.
just sort of another goal of the documentary is to begin to form a bridge between those two camps.
So I want to ask you before we get into your documentary, you also mentioned that you could go further with the birds. So,
Let me elaborate on that just a bit. So, the mechanism, so the fact that birds and other animals, bees, butterflies, turtles, many different animals, they actually use the Earth's magnetic field for their survival, for migratory patterns, etc., for navigation purposes. This has been known about for decades. Um, that this magnetic sense that they have is very key to their survival, and they use it in very practical ways. The question has always been, how does that work? And one mechanism that's been proposed is a chemical compass mechanism. It's called the radical pair mechanism. And basically, how it works is there are specialized molecules within the retina of the bird's eye. Um, when they are light activated, one atom within the molecule transfers an electron to another atom. And so if you know about atoms, an atom, you've got a positive charge in the center from protons and negative charged electrons around the atom. And normally the positive charge in the middle and the negative charge outside is balanced. It's the same, but just a different, one's positive, one's negative. Well, if one atom loses an electron to another, it becomes an ion. There's a charge imbalance. And the way that this happens, it causes these two atoms, the atom that lost the electron and the atom that gained the electron, to become correlated in a way that the two electrons are entangled in a way. More specifically, their spins, the electron spins, are entangled. But the point is that this pair of atoms represents a type of quantum antenna. It's a quantum mechanical object. It's an entangled object. And it then becomes very sensitive to the directionality of the Earth's magnetic field. And so when the bird navigates within the magnetic field, it can sense the orientation of this radical pair, this quantum antenna within the magnetic field. And that's how it is purported to be able to actually visualize, actually sense the Earth's magnetic field for its navigation. So my first, so there's two things that I want to say about this magnetic sense. A recent experiment out of Caltech found that actually humans also have this magnetic sense. And the way they tested it was they put someone in a dark, quiet room where all of their other senses were blocked. And they were able to redirect the magnetic field around the person. And they had the person be in a very sort of relaxed, sort of meditative state. And when that happens, your brain waves are very much peaking at the alpha frequency. But when they shift the magnetic field, there's a dip in that peak, that alpha peak. And that symbolizes that your brain has sensed something. One of your senses has been activated. So if you quiet all the other senses, so there's no sounds, there's no light, there's no noise, it's only the magnetic field orientation that's changing. That's how they were able to determine that humans actually have this magnetic sense as well. We just maybe don't use it like the birds do in our everyday life to navigate. So that's one thing that's interesting. I think that we have a sense that we don't necessarily, that we're not even necessarily all aware of, right? Sounds very similar to, psychics saying that we all have a psychic sense that we're just maybe not tuned into and aware of. And then the second thing I'll say about this radical pair mechanism is it's recently been implicated in how anesthesia works. So we don't have a science of consciousness. We don't know scientifically what is causing neurons to fire, right? But we do know that anesthetics block our experience of consciousness. And even though anesthetics have been used for like 100 years, we don't know how they work, probably because we don't understand how consciousness works. But a recent study found that you can explain the isotope dependence of anesthetics, meaning that some anesthetics work better depending on the isotope that's used. You can explain that if consciousness is somehow being, I guess, is related to the radical pair mechanism, meaning that the anesthetics seem to maybe disable the radical pair mechanism or alter its functioning, and that could be the key to how consciousness is blocked. So in my theory that I'm proposing, I think that the radical pairs are a type of quantum antenna where the brain is like a receiver, like a radio. And the mind itself doesn't exist in the brain, but is being broadcast from somewhere else. And the brain is just picking up that signal via these radical pairs. So going back to how spirits might be able to sort of manipulate the paths of birds or other animals that sense the magnetic field, well, maybe they are signaling to those radical pairs, that quantum antenna in the brain of those animals, um, in the same way that the magnetic field signals to that same antenna, right? The Earth's magnetic field. So they could then manipulate that antenna in the same way that the Earth's magnetic field sort of controls or signals to that antenna. And that would provide an explanation for how any mind that's discarnate would be able to actually sort of affect those animals that sense the Earth's magnetic field.
Um, I have multiple questions I want to ask you about what you just said.
Okay.
Before we go back to it, I want to just ask you about your documentary so we don't leave everyone hanging about that.
For
What
sure.
is your documentary called and what is it about?
Sure. So my documentary is called Playing My Mind's Symphony. It's an hour-long documentary where I have conversations with four amazing women who are experts in different areas of mind and consciousness and the science of spirituality. And my motivation to do the documentary really came about because I discovered this new theory for how mind could be non-local. And for me, I wanted to have these conversations with some experts just as a sanity check, and also just to sort of engage in conversations in a way that would allow me to um, better articulate the theory that I'm putting forth. And I felt like the conversations that we had really helped me to do that, and to get deeper insight from them, and I think them from me. So it really is a conversation, sort of like what you do here on your podcast. I think the work that you're doing is really incredible because we really just need to have more conversations around this science and the science of parapsychology, something that is, again, science and evidence grounded, evidence based. So that's the documentary, and it's now available free to watch. I actually have an additional download that people can purchase, which has even more bonus footage and conversations, but the documentary is available for anyone to watch on my website.
And we'll put the link to that in the show notes so all of you can find it. So, you said it was you found a theory of non local consciousness. Is that the theory you just spoke about, or is there more to it?
Yeah, there's a little bit more to it because, um, a lot of ideas about how consciousness could be non local have been proposed. A lot of them are philosophical arguments. There's the orchestrated objective reduction by Penrose and Stewart and Hameroff that's been proposed. But
Yes, I've talked about that a bit on the podcast. Can you explain it? Because I try to explain it and I'm not smart enough. So, you as a physics
yeah,
professor and physicist can probably explain it better than I can.
absolutely. Let me just frame the question. The question is this: when we see a thought, what do we see? Scientifically, what do we see? And you keep in mind that from our perspective, all we know that thought is correlated with voltage changes in cells. So what do I mean by a voltage change? Cells have this capacity to move ions, again, those atoms that have a imbalance of charge, to move ions in and out of their cell body. And in doing so, it's like a battery. Think of a battery has a certain voltage and it's charged up or it's not charged up. So when a neuron fires, it's really charging up that voltage. And then when it fires, the voltage discharges. So when we see brain waves or we see neurons firing, that's all we're seeing is we're seeing voltage changes within neurons within cells. So that's important to keep in mind. And what Penrose proposed many decades ago, in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, he proposed that the firing of neurons is just the shadow, that that's not the thought itself, that something is causing those neurons to fire, that consciousness is emergent from somewhere else. And the reason he speculated that that was the case is because he used Gödel's theorem. This is an obscure mathematical theorem where there are some truths that can only be understood and not calculated, that there are some things that are beyond calculation. And thus, if we are able to comprehend those mathematical proofs that are beyond calculation, then our thought process itself cannot itself be a calculation. So that was his first philosophical insight as to consciousness must be emergent from something outside of what we can calculate. And because we can pretty much calculate everything physical, I mean, ultimately, the electromagnetic activity within the brain is calculable. It's lies within the laws of physics. He reasoned that something else must be emerging, and the only thing that we don't yet fully understand um, are some questions in regards to quantum mechanics. There are some outstanding questions there. And so he proposed that perhaps there is some quantum processes within the brain that are at the heart of consciousness emerging. And the one mystery in quantum mechanics is this idea of wave function collapse, where you could have something in a superposition of two states, and then when a measurement is performed on it, it collapses into a definitive state. Sort of like this idea that an electron goes through the double slits in the double slit experiment as a wave, and then it's only when it hits the wall and is measured that it collapses into a particular particle. And so he says that that collapse must be where consciousness may emerge from. Now, I have to be honest, I don't actually support this view for a couple of reasons. And that's why I've proposed another quantum based theory, but based on sort of a different premise. The standard interpretation of quantum mechanics is something called the Copenhagen interpretation. And what that says is if you sort of launch a particle through two slits, right, and it's going to hit a wall on the other side, what's interesting is that it appears as if the particle goes through the two slits like a wave. A wave interferes with itself and creates this sort of interference pattern on the back wall. And that's odd because if it was a particle, you would just, every time you launch an electron through, someone would go through the left slit, someone would go through the right slit, and you'd see these two streaks of particles on the back wall. You wouldn't see sort of an array, a band across the whole wall as if waves, peaks of waves were hitting the back wall. But it does appear that you have this interference pattern. So the Copenhagen interpretation says that the particle doesn't necessarily become a wave, but just that its position and where you're probably going to find it moves around like a wave. So there's another interpretation. So it's not saying that the Copenhagen interpretation isn't saying that an electron is a wave when it goes through the two slits. And then when you observe it or you measure it, it becomes a physical particle. It's just saying that the probability of where you're going to find it is moving around like a wave. And we actually can't say anything about a particle until we actually measure it, which is a bit of a cop-out, this Copenhagen interpretation. And, a famous physicist de Broglie at the time of Einstein when quantum mechanics was being developed, sort of called out the Copenhagen interpretation and said, I think we can say something about what's happening physically before we're actually taking a measurement of an object. And it's not that An electron is a wave that then collapses into an electron when we observe it. It's just that an electron is being guided by a wave. So this is the pilot wave theory of quantum mechanics. It's the pilot wave interpretation that was mathematically formalized by David Bohm and first proposed by de Broglie. And it says that things aren't waves that collapse into things when you look at them or when you measure them, but things are simply guided by waves. And that's the pilot waves theory. So when the electron does go through the left slit or the right slit, but it's sort of, think of a ping pong ball on a rippling pond, right? Or if you make waves and you're pushing particles along where the waves are pushing the particles along, that's the sort of idea of the pilot wave interpretation of quantum mechanics. And it definitely gives a more intuitive sense of what's going on in that double slit experiment, and sort of takes out the mystery. And it also takes out the need for this idea that things are collapsing, that things exist in a superposition of multiple states, and then they are measured and they collapse. So because I don't necessarily think that we've established that there is necessarily a collapse of the wave function. The wave function is just a mathematical object. It doesn't necessarily represent something physical. So because of that, I don't think that consciousness is necessarily a result of the collapsing wave function, as Penrose and Hameroff propose. Um, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a sort of quantum mechanical explanation for what is going on. I just don't think that that's the correct one. Another thing about their theory that is different from mine is they suggest that consciousness is sort of like this proto-consciousness that doesn't really have any thoughts. It's more like the energy behind thoughts. And that when the wave function collapses, they're suggesting that microtubules sort of resonate in superposition with one another. And then when that resonance collapses, consciousness emerges. But
And
it's,
that the microtubules are part of our brains and bodies.
yes,
And correct?
microtubules
Mhm.
are the structural element within cells. So they sort of give the structure to cells. And the idea is that the computation of thinking is actually happening at the level of microtubules, where the microtubules are like qubits in a quantum computer performing calculations, which are thoughts. The issue with that, though, is then the thinking is still happening in the neuron, in the microtubules. The thinking is still a calculation that's taking place in the physical structure of the neuron. If you take the studies on mediums seriously, and if you take the accounts of mediums seriously, when the body's gone, the mind is still cognitive. These spirits that the mediums are conversing with and communicating with, they're still perceiving, they're still emoting, they're thinking, and they're commenting on things that have happened since they've passed away. So the cognition can't be a function of the physical mechanisms of the neuron structures or the cellular structures within neurons. The physical, whatever is happening that is causing the information processing of thought, it has to take place outside of anything that is physical. And the physical neurons are simply responding to that. And that's what I've proposed in my theory, is a way by which, first of all, I'm proposing where those information streams that we call minds could exist. And then I'm proposing a mechanism for how they could be communicated to cells via these quantum antenna. So that's really the theory that I outline in the documentary.
Which is exactly the main thing I am obsessively trying to figure out, the how this works. And so you also mentioned the Copenhagen theory, where it's a wave from somewhere else kind of moving along with the particles. And when our observation comes in, it changes that. And is that more along what your theory? Does that tie into your theory a little more and how it would work?
Yeah, I personally think that the Copenhagen interpretation is a mathematical convenience. But I think if we want to intuitively understand physically what is happening, I don't think it translates well to physically what is happening. I think the pilot wave theory gives us a clearer picture, even if it's an analogous one, to what is actually happening. Again, I don't think that a particle has this wave particle duality and that it exists in a wave state. And then when it's being measured or observed, it collapses into an actual particle. I don't think that's what's happening. And that's really not, again, what the Copenhagen interpretation says. The Copenhagen interpretation only says that we actually don't know what's happening with a particle unless we measure it. No one has ever observed a superposition or anything in superposition. It's just a mathematical way of calculating the probability of where we're going to find something when we do measure it. And that makes sense if what you're trying to measure is floating on a bubbling sea, right? It's going to move around a lot and it's going to seem very random where you're going to find it next. So you can develop an equation that describes a fluid and how a fluid oscillates. And that's really what the wave function describing the particle is. It's just the wave function is just a mathematical construct. I don't think it represents what's actually happening in reality.
And what do you think is actually happening in reality with it? Is that's what ties into your theory of consciousness, where you do think it actually ties into consciousness?
Yeah. So for my theory, I'm really pulling together three very different pieces of evidence from three different fields. And one field, of course, is what I did my PhD research in, which is the radical pair mechanism, which again is this quantum antenna that exists in all cells. The other piece of information comes from biology. And then the last piece comes from a new field in quantum physics called relativistic quantum information, which is a bit of a mouthful. But these two fields of biology and RQI have come across some new experimental evidence that really sort of allowed me to sort of come up or propose this mechanism, which I call vacuum orchestrated spin signaling. So, to briefly tell you a little bit about it, um, in RQI, relativistic quantum information theory, they're finding out that they're really they're studying the quantum vacuum. So let me just take a moment to explain what that is. Um, if you were to empty space of all matter, say everything in the room, every single atom in the universe were to suddenly disappear, and again, atoms are made of protons and electrons for the most part. If all of that were to go away, the space around us wouldn't be empty. The vacuum of space is actually bubbling with energy. These bursts of light, as I call them, are popping in and out of existence all the time. These bursts of light are called photons, and it's the photons that govern the electromagnetic force. So why does an electron, you can think of it as orbiting the proton in an atom? What holds an atom together? It's this electromagnetic force. And how does that force emerge? It emerges by protons and electrons exchanging these virtual photons, these bursts of light that are popping in and out of existence from the vacuum. So that seems a little strange that empty space could have this energy that is sort of teeming with life, if you will, in terms of these virtual photons. Well, in relativistic quantum information, they're actually probing the properties of the vacuum. And what they're finding is that the vacuum is this entangled structure. And entanglement is something that is oddly psychic. when we create, let's say, two particles out of energy and let's say two electrons, where one is spinning one way, clockwise, and the other counterclockwise. No matter how far apart we separate them in the universe, if one, if we observe one and it, or we change its spin, the other one changes to be the opposite. They're correlated in a way that seems kind of psychic. So this is quantum entanglement. And
And
the,
do they seem to communicate faster than the speed of light? Am I correct in that? Like somehow
yeah,
the information goes faster than the speed of light. No one really understands why, correct?
yeah, that's the question, right? That's the reason why. So Einstein's theory of general relativity says that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. That seems to be in contradiction of this entanglement, where you have these two objects, and when I look at one, it's spinning this one way and the other is spinning the opposite way. And if you change one, the other changes exactly in the same way. How could they coordinate their activity between one another? How could they be correlated if they're not communicating and they're too far apart to communicate at faster than light speed? So that's called non-locality. And that non-locality is sort of in contradiction to general relativity. And which is why the Copenhagen interpretation, I think, is the one that was sort of decided upon by Einstein and Oppenheimer and all of those at the time over the pilot wave interpretation that David Bohm proposed. And that's because in the pilot wave interpretation, the pilot wave is a fully entangled structure, meaning the wave that is sort of orchestrating the motion or affecting the motion of all matter in the universe, it's actually an entangled structure. But in this new field of relativistic quantum information, what they're finding is that the vacuum of space actually is an entangled structure. And it's constantly bubbling with virtual particles all of the time. And these virtual particles have been known about. This isn't a mystery. This is the foundation of quantum field theory, which is a very well-known, well-tested theory. But you can think of these virtual particles as like a bubbling ocean, as like a bubbling sea. And what do the virtual photons do? Well, they orchestrate the electromagnetic force. Why do opposite charges attract and like charges repel? Well, it's because they're exchanging these virtual photons from the vacuum. So in that sense, the vacuum, this bubbling vacuum of space with these bubbling virtual photons, appears very much like the pilot wave theory of quantum mechanics, where physical things, again, aren't waves themselves that are collapsing into objects, but they're objects that are just being guided by waves in a way that seems random, right? But in a way that is that we can calculate through the quantum wave function. So, in the interesting thing that was discovered in relativistic quantum information is that the vacuum acts like a pilot wave in a sense, where it has information about all matter in the universe, if you will. Um, so the reason the behavior of the motion of a particle seems to move around like random is because um, again, that wave is moving particles around. And so according to the pilot wave theory, it really isn't random, it's deterministic, but unless you know what the entire wave is doing, you don't know what one particle is doing, because what happens to one particle depends on what's happening to the entire wave. And what's happening to the entire wave depends on how all the other particles are interacting with the wave. So it's almost like an ocean of connectedness. That's what entanglement is. It's almost like this field, this field of connectedness, where what they're finding, and this is what is, I think, most remarkable. It was thought that you could only entangle objects that are kind of created together, right? And but now they're finding actually objects that have never met and will never meet because they're too far apart. They're too far apart to signal one another with light signaling or to send a cell phone call and coordinate with one another. That these objects can actually become entangled by harvesting entanglement from the quantum vacuum. And these experiments have actually been done where you can entangle objects that have never been in contact with one another simply by harvesting the entanglement of the vacuum. And that the objects can then obtain information about one another via that entanglement through the vacuum. So, in essence, the vacuum itself, the vacuum of space itself, can hold information, and that information can be communicated at any distance um, through its entangled structure, which seems like the perfect sort of mechanism by which one could explain how a mind as an information stream could exist in the vacuum. And then information about other minds could be shared in through this vacuum entanglement.
So it would work that like our consciousness would be in I'm trying to remember the words. I was visually picturing, because that's how I put things together very visually, everything you were saying, but now I'm forgetting the proper words. But like, so all the like little bubbly energy entangled particles that are making up our universe, that are communicating, with material matter and holding information, that could store our personalities and quantum entangle with our brains while we're here. And then when we pass, that information still stays there. And because, you know, there's a part of my information that's probably there now, quantum entangling with me. All of my dad's information is there because he's passed. And that can then go quantum entangle with me, and probably much easier with a medium, or a medium would understand and interpret it better, because it's all of that. We could kind of quantum entangle with almost any physical brain in this material world. Am I explaining this right?
Yeah, you're definitely getting there. I'll summarize it as well. I'm proposing through in my theory that minds exist in the quantum vacuum, and they exist as information streams within that quantum vacuum. And I'm proposing the medium by which they communicate with cells is through the quantum antenna, the radical pairs in the cells. Because in relativistic quantum information, the only thing you need to entangle with the quantum vacuum and to harvest information from the vacuum is a quantum antenna. So I'm proposing that the radical pairs are that quantum antenna. The radical pairs are the quantum antenna within our cells that are actually able to interact with the quantum vacuum. And the medium of interaction, I think, are the virtual particles that pop in and out of existence from the vacuum. And so how it's really three components, where our mind is an information stream in the quantum vacuum, and it's communicated to cellular quantum antenna via these forces of light from the vacuum. So think of the virtual particles, the virtual photons, these forces of light popping in and out of existence. Those are like the veil. I know Laura Lynn Jackson also talks about how the deceased, they're all around us. These discarnate minds, they're all around us. They're in the space around us. So that really correlates with what I'm saying, that they're in this vacuum space, and the information of those minds are being broadcast to the quantum antenna in our cells via these virtual photons, these bursts of light that pop in and out between their dimension and our dimension, if you will.
So I actually have quite a few questions about this. First, I'll start with you and me. Is our consciousness over there on the other side in these, you used a beautiful physics word, I'm using the woo other side, quantum veil, the quantum veil. So is our consciousness there too, as well as our deceased loved ones? And the difference is that our consciousness is quantum entangling with a young enough body that it's living. And then when we pass, it's still just there. It's just that we're having this extra experience while we're there, we're having this extra experience fully quantum entangling with an existing person body.
So
Is
yeah,
that
according to my theory, VOS, vacuum orchestrated spin signaling, all minds are in the vacuum. That's where that information stream exists. They're just broadcasting to, like, your mind is broadcasting to your brain, and my mind is broadcasting to my brain. And the receiver, again, are these quantum antenna. And the way the broadcasting works is there are these virtual photons constantly popping in and out of existence. And it seems random, but I'm suggesting that a mind can actually sway the randomness of those virtual photons, can sort of deflect them away from their random trajectory to effectuate the radical pair antenna, to move it, to nudge it one way or another, to nudge it in a way that causes the neuron to fire or doesn't cause the neuron to fire, and vice versa. So there's this information feedback, this sensory feedback that we're having in our physical world, that is sending sensory information to the brain, and that through radical pairs is being sort of recorded, if you will, in the vacuum that's being perceived. And then also the intentionality is being effectuated, and I think there's some evidence for this. There was a recent study, really amazing. I'll get the reference for you momentarily, but this was done by a Dr. Friedman, and the paper is called "Enhanced Mind Matter Interactions Following RTMS Induced Frontal Lobe Inhibition."
Morris Friedman?
Yes.
You have to tell everyone. I saw him speak at the SSE conference, Society for Scientific Exploration, and there were some wonderful presentations. His was my favorite. I'm obsessed with him and his presentation. So tell our listeners about it.
Yeah, so this 2024 paper, I think, is really pivotal. What they found is that, if you have a random event, think of a coin toss, heads, tails, heads, tails. You do it 100 times, you'll get about 50 heads, 50 tails. What they, but this random event wasn't based on a coin flip. It was based on a quantum mechanical event, a random event in quantum physics, specifically electron tunneling. And if we think of that pilot wave interpretation of quantum physics, again, the randomness of how the electron moves is based on the pilot wave, okay? And there is a proposal that, again, the pilot wave is the virtual particles, let's say, the virtual photons popping in and out of existence, that those are the waves that electrons are dancing on, if you will. What they found is that a person with their mind could actually deflect the randomness, the random outcome, of these quantum tunneling events, to sort of skew them away from, being, again, going back to the coin analogy, instead of being mostly head or all half heads, half tails, skew them to more tails, let's say, to that. That's a great analogy. And so, how could that happen? Well, that's sort of evidence of what I'm saying, that the consciousness and information stream is able to effectuate the sort of random behavior of this pilot wave, right? The virtual photons popping in and out of existence, it seems random, but consciousness has a way of deflecting it away from its random trajectory, right? And so I'm proposing that that's actually what's happening as thoughts interface with the brain. That, that's how this signaling is working. That agency itself is a deflection away from the random behavior of these virtual particles, and that is, of course, something that could be tested. But I think that this experiment, at least at some level, is evidence that that could be the case.
Wow. This is, I have to be honest, your theory is like my favorite one. I've heard about how I ask everyone, but where is our non-local consciousness? How does it work? This is the first like theory of a mechanism that I'm like, for what it's worth, as not a physicist, but someone who's done nothing but like read about this stuff for years. This is the one that makes the most sense that I've ever heard.
No,
I
I
I'm so excited. I'm like jumping out of my skin now. I knew I was excited for our conversation, but now I'm like, okay, do you have like 8 hours? I'm probably going to make you come back on a second time. Sorry to say.
I think what I'm excited about is I think a lot of scientists are kind of on the fence about even looking at the behavioral studies in parapsychology. And I'm hoping, I think again, it's because they can't think of a way that this could be possible based on physics that we actually know. Even the Penrose Hameroff mechanism supposes a lot of underlying physics that we don't know yet, that we don't really have yet, that there is a wave function collapse, that gravity somehow collapses it, that in that wave function collapse, consciousness somehow emerges, that microtubules are engaged in quantum computation. Those are a lot of ifs. And I think what I'm proposing is sort of looking at, well, what do we actually know? Right? We know the quantum vacuum is a store of information. We know it's entangled. We know entanglement seems very psychic, right? It seems like there's a correlation between things that are otherwise not able to communicate through normal sensory means, right? Or through light signaling. So we have that evidence where we're actually able to sort of teleport information, if you will, from one quantum object to another. So you have, we know that that information can be accessed with a quantum antenna. We know that we have a quantum antenna within our cells. The radical pair mechanism has been tested in sort of in vitro experiments, meaning not within the bird's eyes, but we know that these radical pairs, these quantum antennae, are sensitive to magnetic fields. We know that we have interactions with virtual particles. We mean the vacuum particles. We know that they have interactions with light. We know that they are somehow implicated in how anesthetics work, which is also very compelling. That the anesthetics seem to disable this quantum antenna in our cells, and that's what shuts consciousness off. So there's that evidence, um, and then there's the evidence that on the biology side, which I haven't talked with, and that's been pioneered by Michael Levin and Monica Gagliano, who discovered that plants have consciousness
Okay.
by doing the Pavlov dog experiments, but with plants.
Can
So
you tell us about those experiments? I've heard of Clive Baxter. I know some of his research. It's probably similar, but yeah, I haven't heard of either of them, and I don't think we've ever talked about the experiments with plant consciousness. So, hey
yeah,
everyone. I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title.
yeah, I go into it a lot in the documentary with some demonstrations to help illustrate it, but I'll try to explain it without visuals. When we talk about mind, what we're really talking about is agency and free will, right? And the question is, what is an agent? What has a mind, right? One of the best tests of mind is associative learning. It's sort of a higher level of learning rather than just stimulus reaction. And it's learning that happens on sub-evolutionary timescales. So it's learning that can't be the result of Darwin's evolution over a long time. So when something is capable of associative learning, we really feel that, okay, that's a mind and that's an agent. That's something that has free will and that is thinking and perceiving and processing and imagining. So the Pavlov dog experiment, of course, is where you can train a dog to associate dinner with a bell. And whenever dinner comes, the dog salivates. If you just ring the bell, the dog initially doesn't salivate. It doesn't really care about the bell. But if you always ring the bell just before dinner comes, then the dog begins to learn that the bell means dinner is coming. So it'll start to salivate even when it just hears the bell and dinner isn't even there. So it's sort of imagining that dinner is coming. And we know that about dogs. We know they have this mental capacity to think and to perceive and to imagine. Well, Monica Gagliano, she describes it in her book, Thus Spoke the Plant. She did an experiment where she did the same conditioning experiment with pea plants. And instead of for dinner is light. So you keep the plant in the dark. The plant wants light. You're going to shine the light from one direction. So the plant wants to bend towards the light. And it takes time for the plant to bend. It takes a lot of energy for the plant to bend. So the plant wants to make sure it bends in the right direction to know where light is coming from. Normally, it'll just bend in the direction where light was the day before. But you can train the plant to associate the light with a fan. So the plant doesn't really care about a fan normally, but if the plant can learn within 3 days that the direction the wind from the fan is coming from is the direction the light's going to come from. So after 3 days of this conditioning, even when there's no light, the plant will bend towards the direction of the fan, which is pretty incredible if you think about it, because the plant is learning very quickly and it's anticipating dinner or the light coming, and the light isn't there. So it's almost like it has this imaginative capacity to imagine that the light is coming, even though it isn't actually there. Um, Even more remarkable, Michael Levin, who is a biologist out of Tufts University, discovered that gene regulatory networks also are capable of associative learning and associative memory. What is a gene regulatory network? So every cell in our body has the same set of genes. It has the same DNA, right? And genes tell the cell what proteins to make. So sort of like proteins and acids to digest the food in your stomach, right? You wouldn't want, your eyes have those same genes, but you wouldn't want those genes turned on in your eye, right? You wouldn't want your eye to start producing stomach acid, right? That would be very bad. So we have these regulatory networks that switch certain genes on depending on the function of what the cell is going to do, what the cell's function is. And what Michael Levin discovered is that you can train a gene regulatory network where you introduce a drug and it has a certain response. And then you introduce another inert drug, like a placebo, and it doesn't have the same response. But if you introduce the two of them together and you train the network, then very shortly the network will learn that even when it just gets the placebo, to have the same effect. Now, gene regulatory networks are subcellular. They're basically collections of molecules. They're proteins, which are just collections of molecules. But they're showing signs of consciousness. So in that respect, again, consciousness wouldn't be emergent from microtubule structures, which are larger than that, right? Consciousness has to be coming from something more fundamental, more at the atomic scale, which again is what my radical pair mechanism is proposing, that again, the consciousness is sort of being signaled um, to these molecules, that the molecular behavior that we're seeing is being orchestrated somewhere else. And the last piece of evidence I'll leave you with to sort of support that is also comes from Michael Levin's work, where he discovered that, when an embryo develops, there are a lot of cells that are identical, but the cells have to differentiate. So just take my hand. If one cell is going to be a thumb and one is going to be a pinky, what he found is that those cells take on a different voltage. Right? So maybe my thumb is 5 volts and my pinky is 1 volt, right? Um, and how do cells take on a different voltage? Well, they move those ions in and out of their cell wall. And the cells then create a pattern, which is the human body. And what's interesting is that voltage, where the voltage instructions that tells these cells that are going to be a thumb to take on a voltage of 5 volts, that information isn't in the DNA. It's not in the genes. And so it's always been a mystery of how cells know how to differentiate to form a body when no one cell knows what the body looks like. And what Michael Levin discovered is that they are changing their voltage, and the voltage itself is in a map of the body, right? And the question, though, is where does each cell get the voltage instructions from if it's not in the DNA, right? That's really the question. And no
Where
one really knows. But again, that's why my sort of theory of vacuum orchestrated spin signaling could be a mechanism by which that occur, because I'm proposing that the information in the vacuum is where that voltage map resides, that voltage map that tells cells what voltage to take on to sort of form a body. Um, and that is signaled via, again, these radical pairs, which then could tell a cell what voltage to take, what voltage it should have. So the point, though, I think, is that that information of the voltage map doesn't exist in the genes. It's not hardwired anywhere. It has to be coming from somewhere else. And so that's why I'm proposing that the information of consciousness perhaps resides in the quantum vacuum and is communicated to cells via this mechanism.
so fascinating. So do you have any thoughts or theories on the difference between psychic mediums? First, I'll ask you about psychic mediums versus all of us, and I'll ask you about psychic information versus mediumship information. But psychic mediums versus all of us. Do you have any theories at all on how they are able to do they either get more information than us, interpret it better? What is the difference between me and a psychic medium?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Um, I think you can imagine there's this theory, this philosopher. I think his name is Bernardo Kastrup, I think.
Renato Kastrup, yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah. He's proposed that maybe there's just one mind, but that each of us is a dissociative identity within that mind. So think of someone with multiple personality disorder, where they have these sort of different personalities. And so if you imagine that all of the information of all minds sort of exists in this quantum vacuum, and maybe they're just different frequencies, you can also imagine that the the information that you have access, your memories, it's sort of like um, a bubble. And you can maybe expand that bubble to incorporate other information, or you can reduce it. I think ultimately it's a point of focus, and what information are you focusing on? So I think that everyone maybe has the capacity to attain non-local information beyond sort of the boundaries of their own memories. And I think that's what psychics are doing in particular. I think mediums are, I think if our minds exist in the vacuum, I think the less we're focused on the physical, the more we have access to what that mind is able to perceive in the vacuum. And that maybe those conversations are taking place in that realm, and communication is taking place in the vacuum. And it's just a matter of what are, I think the brain is a focusing mechanism. I think that Dr. Friedman's work really describes the brain as a filter. I describe it as a focusing mechanism, like a lens. It's sort of focusing the broadcast from the vacuum purely on the brain and the body. And if you've seen that rubber hand experiment, you know how quickly your focus leads to a sense of who you are and what you are, right? In the rubber hand experiment, if you focus on the artificial hand long enough as you're getting sensory feedback that seems to be coming from it, then you begin to very quickly believe that that hand is yours, so much so that if it's threatened with a hammer, the you'll jump. You'll have a physiological reaction thinking that something that isn't you is you. So I think our minds that are in the vacuum are so hyper focused on our bodies and the sensory input coming to the bodies that we're tuning out other information. And so, what I think is amazing about Dr. Friedman's most recent study, which, by the way, was the third replication of a psychokinesis study, and it had really high significance, which has been another problem that has plagued parapsychological studies, is there seems to be an effect, but it's sometimes barely significant. And I think the scientific community sort of argues, well, maybe that's an anomaly. Maybe it's not really significant. But what he did is he temporarily suppressed the activity or the functioning of the left hemisphere of the brain.
This is the one that I saw at the SSE. Yeah, not the
Right.
other one. So yeah, explain. Yeah, I guess.
And so, yeah, by temporarily suppressing that aspect of the brain, I think the mind in the vacuum could no longer broadcast to that. It's sort of like disrupting the rubber hand experiment, where you disrupt the focus momentarily and suddenly the mind is able to focus on something else, which was this quantum process that the person was trying to effectuate. So rather than focusing all of the mind concentration on, as I like to say, playing the quantum antenna in your neurons, if some of those neurons are offline, it's like playing a piano. If you're constantly playing the piano with both hands, your left hand and your right hand, your left brain and your right brain, if the mind is constantly playing the left brain and right brain, it's hard to use the mind to access other information. But if you disrupt the left brain, then suddenly you have a hand free that's free to affect effectuate other systems, other quantum systems, other quantum antenna via those virtual photons. And again, in that experiment, it was the participants were effectively changing the outcome of quantum tunneling, which again, it's like if you go by the pilot wave theory, the mind is again changing that wave, that pilot wave, to change how the electron is moving. So it doesn't look random anymore, but it looks skewed in one particular direction.
And the quantum tunneling, they were moving, I believe, an arrow in one direction versus another. That was supposed to be moving non-random. That was moving randomly, and they made it move non-randomly one direction over another. Right? Correct? Make sure.
Absolutely. What they
Yeah.
did was just to give the participant a visual, they
Hmm.
showed an arrow, but the motion of that arrow was linked to a random number generator. And if you look in the
Oh.
study, the random number generator, if you look at the manufacturer, the design that the random number generator is based on, it's based on quantum tunneling. So think quantum
Mm.
tunneling, think of a pool ball, and imagine you strike the pool ball and it bounces around. And if there were no friction, it would just bounce around forever, hitting the walls of the pool table. But what if sometimes it jumps the pool table, right? Or tunnels through the wall and ends up on the other side. That's quantum tunneling. And the if you look at the pilot wave theory, it's the ball is being guided by a wave, and so sometimes it jumps over. Just depending on how the ball lands on the crest of a wave, it might jump over the edge of the pool table. So that's a tunneling event, and it's like a random event. You never know when the next tunneling event is going to happen. And so what this random number generator does is it takes the time between tunneling events and it asks, was the time between the last tunneling event greater than or less than? That's how it converts it to a binary number, greater than or less than. So if the next tunneling event happens in a shorter time span than the last tunneling event, then that's skewing the arrow one direction. If it's greater, if it takes more time for the tunneling event to happen than the last time, then that skews the arrow the other way. So over time, the arrow is just going to stay in the middle. It's like a coin flip, heads, tails, 50-50. It's not going to move left or right much at all. But the participants were able to move the arrow more to the right with their intention, with just their intention, which again, is what I'm proposing, that these virtual photons, we think they're random, or we think they're described purely by the standard model of physics, and we think that that's purely calculable. But what I'm proposing is that in living systems, there's a deviation. That in living cells or in living systems, organic gene regulatory networks, that the radical pairs are being nudged by minds in the vacuum. They're being nudged. And what we see as agency in our physical world are gentle nudges from minds in the quantum vacuum that are effectuating these quantum antenna.
Okay. Um, so one thing that I've been thinking about a lot with a lot of what you were saying is, how are we people here? Like, okay, so if we're all, our consciousness is on the other side, and that was actually a theory I had too in a type of quantum particle. And now, are we individuals there? Are we, I mean, maybe individuals who've lived multiple lives, according to the research of Dr. Jim Tucker. But what does it say for individuality, first of all? And yeah,
Yeah.
I'll stick with that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when you think about information, has these properties of frequency and amplitude, and we could I think the easiest way to think of it as each individual person as an individual frequency, right? So think of frequency as a note, like every note on a piano is a different frequency, or every color of the rainbow is a different frequency. So I think I think the identity and the individuality really is a function of what information one has access to and what information one attributes to your own memories. And by own memories, I mean memories of experience that have happened to a particular physical structure, i.e., your body, right? And that well of information then creates a boundary of what we call our own personal identity. Um, I think Michael Levin makes a really good point, though, that, you know, we kind of have a bit of a dissociative identity within ourselves. Like in cancer, a cell stops communicating with its neighbors and stops acting as one with its neighbors in an organ and reverts back to its amoeba self, where it has its own goals and its own agency. And what's it going to do? It's going to go where it can get the most resources for its survival, and it's going to procreate. That's metastacism. And so and why do the cells in our body not all do that? Why do they form an organ and work together to sort of differentiate? Why do they take on the same voltage to form a particular organ and to have a particular function? It's because they're getting these voltage instructions from somewhere, right? And it's only when the signaling between the cells is somehow disrupted that the cell goes rogue and reverts back to its own identity. And Michael Levin is finding that you can actually stop a cancerous cell from metastasizing by simply not allowing it to stop communicating with its neighbors, by holding its voltage. Just with the voltage, you can, by manipulating the voltage of the cancerous cell, you can stop it from metastasizing. You can also signal to cells to regenerate and to regenerate limbs, and in animals that don't normally regenerate limbs. So how do we go from an individual cellular identity to this collective identity, um, um, to then this body identity? I also think that, you know, a lot of the neurons firing in our brain could be very reactionary, just sensory input, reactionary output, right? I don't know if the mind in the vacuum is necessarily, or, how, what is sort of automatic and what is sort of actively being orchestrated. There's this interesting study on mind reading with ChatGPT. Um, I think his name is Alexander Huth is the scientist. What they did is they had people listen to podcasts and they mapped their brains, and they mapped sort of words and phrases and expressions, and they used a language learning model in order to find patterns. And then what they did is, after 20 hours of sort of mapping a person's brain as they're listening to stories, then if they had a person read a book or watch a movie, just based on the brain activity, they were able to tell what the person was reading. So it's like a mind reading. And the experimenter happened to participate in one of the experiments, but he said something that I found interesting, is that he was watching a movie of a girl reaching out to a wounded dog or animal, and it was bleeding. And the readout from the mind reading software was, I'm stretching out my hand to touch the animal and help it. But the experimental says, at that moment, I was actually thinking, oh no, don't do that. It's going to bite you. So there's this dual mental processing going on, where this deeper mind is having a reaction, almost as if the body, the avatar, is sort of going through this emotion in life, and our minds are sort of telling the avatar what to do. But we know that that executive functioning isn't on all the time. Say when someone's sleepwalking, for example, people can sleepwalk, they can eat, they can drink, they can talk, but it's not them. Like the personality is somehow gone. So maybe the vacuum mind, that identity, um, is more than, again, just sort of the perception, reaction, that stimulus response mechanisms that are taking place in our body and in our brain. So it's definitely an open question, though.
And do you think also, this is speculative, so there's so much evidence that we live past lives, and if our main consciousness is non-local, let's say it's our little personality that's stored non-locally, do you think we could be living multiple lives at the same time? That this little bit of consciousness is maybe quantum entangling with like 4 bodies on Earth and maybe a couple bodies on other Goldilocks planets. What do
Well,
you think of that?
well, I will say this. I'll say that um, from the if the mind is just an information stream in the quantum vacuum, it would be massless. it would be like light itself. And I know a lot of mediums say, spirits, they're beings of light. Okay. We do know that from the perspective of light, there is no time. So, from our perspective, we know what the speed of light is. It takes light a certain amount of time to travel from one point to the next point. But from the reference frame of light, it leaves and arrives at the same time. No time passes. And that's a function of Einstein's theory of relativity.
Can you explain that further about light and time?
Yeah, so I will try in the time that we have. But I'm so passionate about this, I think, as you are, and just really passionate to get to the bottom of how can we explain this. And I think what makes me and probably you so passionate about this is we know that it's real because we've experienced it, right? And I think that makes a difference. I talk about these experiences in my documentary. I've had out-of-body experience. I've had successful remote viewing
Oh,
experiences.
yeah. I plan to ask you all about you said you have personal experiences too. So, yeah, do you want to tell me about the light and then share your personal experiences? And then
So there's a basic notion of relativity. And the best way to understand relativity is, let's say you're standing on a train platform and you see someone standing on a train. And if the train isn't moving and the person walks from one end of the train car to the other, you can calculate the speed that they're moving, right? But let's say, they're moving, I don't know, 5 meters per second or something like that, right? Now, let's say the train, though, starts moving at 10 meters per second. Now, what speed do you see the person moving at? Now, from the person's perspective, they're saying, oh, I'm still moving at 5 meters per second. But from your perspective, you're looking at them and you're like, no, they're moving 15 meters per second because it's their speed plus the train's speed, right? So there's a relative difference between how I observe your speed and how the person itself observes its speed, right? So the same thing is true with light. Let's say instead of the person moving in the train car, the person is standing at the back of the train car and turns on a flashlight. Now, light moves very fast, but let's imagine that we can calculate it from our platform and we see the light beam move across the train car, right? From the perspective of the light beam, let's say that a photon, which is a particle of light, let's say it has a mind, right? From its perspective, no time passes, okay? From the time it's turned on, it leaves and arrives at the exact same time, right? And so time is really just a function of things with mass, right? Electrons, protons, things that have mass. Photons, particles of light, don't have mass. And those are the only sort of particles that move at the speed of light. So anything that moves at the speed of light would not experience that transition of time from its departure and its arrival. But us observing the light, we do see the light from our reference frame as having that time.
wow, something just clicked in my mind with this in some way, because I have always, not always, but since researching this, really understood how if you travel at the speed of light, the information stored in the light, nothing's changing. Like the light waves, everything it's capturing. I'll just take a really simplistic thing, like my cup right here. So it's taking that visual cup, the movement of the cup within a second. Those are a few different seconds, different light snapping that. If I was to be traveling at the speed of light, that cup would just be staying still in that exact moment. And from here, I'm watching myself age. I'm watching, sadly, people die. We're watching all these things, but with the information of light going at the speed of light, nothing's changing. It's staying the exact same. They're in that split second. And then going faster, um, the time is moving backwards, which I don't know. Somehow, just realizing that myself sitting here, I'm suddenly seeing how like time and movement are tied in with that and with light in some way. I can't really put it in words, but it was something just clicked somehow related to that just watching like biological changes. And that's watching a type of some way of just our perspective, as if there's a different perspective, and with light and a different light where it's exactly the same, and there are different moments of within the light rather than the time linear flow movement that we're experiencing here. It really is just a type of observation, like some other, I mean, I've heard the words of that, but something just clicked somehow right
Oh,
now a little more, if that makes sense. Am I making any sense? I haven't processed this enough to know if I should even be saying this on my podcast yet.
yes, and even me, I mean, when we talk about relativity, it is mind-boggling how the notion of causality and do things happen at the same time or is one thing happening before the other, how that's not going to be the same depending on which observer you're talking about, the observer on the train versus the observer on the platform. So yeah, relativity is a whole nother rabbit hole, but I think the point that
Chills.
we can take away from it is that the notion of time really is something that's associated to objects moving in space time, mass objects. And so that idea that the perspective of a being of light could be different, I don't know. I think it has some scientific grounding in what we actually already understand scientifically. Not that I can necessarily wrap my head around multiple lives happening all at the same time, but
But I think in some way it might tie in with like we're getting photos of deep space. If there are beings that are really advanced, they're getting photos of deep space and they're looking at Earth. And I think we recently found, was it Alpha? I forget what it's called, but we found another Goldilocks planet. If we're looking at it and we see a human civilization, this will be a civilization millions of years ago. Even 10,000 years ago, you'd see something so different. I mean, it'd be much more than 10,000. So there could be a species looking at our planet right now, advanced like us, being like, wow, look, we've discovered life on the planet and it's dinosaurs. And they're looking at it right now. Like they could not in deep space be looking at humans. And
right.
if you think of another planet advancing in millions of years, they could be looking at us right in this moment in like, but it'd be in 2 million years because they wouldn't be able to look at the current. And that's just when I think of time and light, that is the thing when I think of looking at information in deep space. It just is like,
I would say to that is, think of our physical world as like the surface of a balloon, right? And to get to one end of the balloon to another, it takes a lot of time, right? To see what's happening on the other side of the balloon. But think of the interior as sort of like the quantum vacuum that's entangled. And imagine that being in that quantum vacuum, you can see everything all at once because you're in the center. Like you have a clear view of everything on the surface. Whereas if you're on the surface, you have to take time to go observe something far away. So I think that might be sort of maybe a helpful kind of analogy to think about how, our concept of information, the information we have access to, could be different when we were in a physical form versus when we're just a mind in the vacuum. That higher dimensionality, if that's what maybe it could be, um, affords us access to more information.
so, okay, so you've had some personal experiences. What were those?
Oh gosh. Well, the documentary begins where I describe I think the most profound experience I had, which is an out of body experience. And what it did for me is it really gave me the visceral understanding that I am not my body. And I think we have to be sympathetic to scientists who may be skeptical of that notion, or anyone who's skeptical of that notion, because it's a really hard thing to grasp if you've never actually experienced it in any sort of visceral way. But for me, it was like that rubber hand experiment where my whole life I'd been staring at that rubber hand thinking that was me. And then suddenly something broke that focus. And I woke up and realized that I was just this infinite energy. And it was just really profound and incredible. Um, and I've also attended just a number of workshops. I've done remote viewing with Russell Targ, who was head of the CIA Stargate program. That was my first remote viewing experience. And then I had another successful remote viewing experience with Laura Lynn Jackson and her workshop. I also attended a workshop with James Van Praagh, where we had to give mediumship readings to other people. And I had never had any mediumship experiences before, but simply going into a meditative state and literally asking for the information. Um, one of the mediums I interview in my documentary, that's exactly how she describes it works. Sure enough, it can work. I would encourage anyone to, try to give a reading to someone else by just getting quiet and asking for some information to come in. And especially if the information is completely random to you and has no meaning to you, when you convey it to the other person and they say, "Oh, that's my father," that definitely relates to him. Um, Literally, it gives you chills when that happens. I've had instances of, claircognizance, and I attended a past life regression therapy training with Dr. Brian Weiss, um, the author of Many Lives, Many Masters. And so that was really, really fascinating as well. So again, I think it's really important for scientists to at least try to have these experiences. Not that they, in and of themselves, represent scientific proof, because at the end of the day, my experiences are just anecdotal. From a scientific perspective, someone might argue, well, it's a one off, it's not statistically significant. But I think once you have that experience for yourself, you're not making it up. You're not a charlatan, right? Then you're more inclined to sort of believe and be understanding of other people's accounts, and to really explore parapsychology and the science behind it in an authentic way.
And when was your out of body experience your first weird experience? And
Yes, yes. I would say I had been on a path. I'd definitely been ripening my mind. I'd just read a lot of books like Marianne Williamson's A Return to Love and A Course in Miracles. And I was always very much a seeker. Um, uh, Walsh's Conversations with God, and then moving on to more Buddhist teachings, and started studying meditation, Zen Buddhist meditation. Um, the Power of Now as well really sort of helped me to see, I would say, The Power of Now, and this book called You Can Be Happy No Matter What. It's by a psychologist, but just even the idea that you have the capacity to step outside of your thoughts and not be completely immersed in your story, but to just sort of objectively look at your story or the thoughts that come up and go by without engaging in them, without necessarily having an emotional response to them. So that putting some distance between the awareness observer self and the thought streams, I think sort of ripened my mind for that experience to occur. And then when I had this sort of strong emotional shock, sort of that's when it happened. Again, it was something that allowed me to dissociate from the focus of my body and the focus within my story and my own thought streams. And I sort of experienced myself as something much greater.
And had anything triggered your OBE or?
Yes, I would say almost like a little bit, I wouldn't say a mental break, it was a mental shock. It was, I asked a question, I was feeling very desperate for an answer, and I was very alone. And I asked a question like to God, the universe, why help, And the very next day, I got an answer that was very poignant. And I think that, oh my gosh, is this really real? Do I really have a spirit guide? Do I really have a team of light, people looking out for me, answering me, getting, I think, a message like that can be such a shock. And I was in a place of such quiet that I just did some yoga. And when I was lying in Shavasana, boom, I just left, because my only thought at the time was surrender. Surrender to whatever this is that is reaching out to me. I want to reach out to it. And I think, again, I think our identity is very much a focal point. And I think shifting my focal point to that, where that was my only thought and my only desire, I think all of my agency sort of allowed me to, again, dissociate. Again, I go back to that rubber hand experiment. You have sort of a break in the focusing on the fake hand. You realize, oh, I'm not that
This
fake
is
hand.
today's episode of my conversation with Dr. Tiffeny Todd. She earned her
Join us
PhD
next
in
week for
physics
part
from the
2.
University of... Hi! So, exciting news. Book number 2, WTF Just Happened? A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Even More Evidence of an Afterlife and Fights for Justice with Her Dead Dog, is ready. You can get it everywhere in both ebook and paper. This book essentially picks up where WTF Part 1 left off. I continue to experience a bunch of what the fuckery, and it's a bit different now because I know the mediums pretty well, so I get some actual opinions on what they thought of me when they first met me. I get more crazy signs, and the evidence just keeps accumulating. I keep bugging my dad for that one sign I really, really wanted, and some really crazy stuff happens related to that. I conduct experiments with psychic medium Joe Peretta, and again, bunch of what the fuckery. And in a really weird twist, I get called as a secondary witness to testify in the Harvey Weinstein case, which is a secondary plot. And that results in my dog, Peanut, who is on the other side and sending me some signs, ends up becoming famous. So, if you want to keep hearing about scientific evidence of an afterlife and this really bizarre side story, you can go order my second book in the series. I love getting to say it that now. WTF Just Happens, actually a series. So you can go to my website, and that links to everywhere this book's available. It's available in ebook and print, not yet audiobook. That's not going to be nearly as long as it was for book 1, but it's going to be a few more months. So you can go to my website and order WTF Just Happened? A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Even More Evidence of an Afterlife and Fights for Justice with Her Dead Dog. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened? A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?